Hey, this is Matt at the Quantum Leap podcast, and I'm super excited today because, as you know, I've been speaking to a number of the authors from the Innovation comic book range recently, and today on the show, I've got none other than the editor, George Broderick Jr. George, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Matt. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so glad to have you because, as I say, we've been doing a bit of a deep dive recently, and that deep dive is going to be going on over the next few months. But we couldn't possibly do a deep dive without speaking to the man behind the range. So perhaps we could just start off by setting the scene a little bit. So the range started in, was it 91, at a point where Quantum Leap was probably on TV at its highest in terms of the ratings, but there was no tie-in media at the time. There were no spin-off novels. What was going on in your world at the time? Were you involved in other comic book ranges? How did you come to be involved in Quantum Leap, and how did
I've
range?
been watching Quantum Leap since the very first episode, and I quite enjoyed it. I'm a sucker for time travel movies and stories to begin with. And when I was working at Innovation, when I started out in the summer of 1990, we were doing some superhero things that David Campetti, the publisher, had brought over from other publishers, other companies he had worked for. And we were like a C or D level company at that time. But then someone at the office, and this was right before I came there, got the license to do the Anne Rice vampire novels. And those things took off, and they had fandom. So we decided, and the people that were involved with it were very passionate about the project. So it became kind of a running theme at the office. If you had a project you were passionate about, talk it up and we'll see if we could get the license. And at that point, David had gotten the license to Lost in Space, which became another big hit for us. And one of our writers, he's a Hollywood guy named Andy Mangles, was getting us licenses through Universal Studios for Child's Play and for Nightmare on Elm Street. And I went to Dave. I said, Dave, we have to do Quantum Leap. And it was kind of, he said, yeah, it's a good show, but I said, we have to do it. And we had not done one that was currently running on TV at the time. So we jumped through all the hoops and got the license going. And I was going to write the first issue, and I would write all the leap-ins to the subsequent issues. But my goal at that time was to pick from my writing pool writers who had real-world experience in the areas that they had. So, for instance, issue number 2, Bob Ingersoll, who wrote that, spent the bulk of his career as a public defender in Cleveland. So I said, well, I'm going to give him something legal. Plus, I was playing games with Bob, so I came up with the whole, he leaps into a guy in the electric chair. I said, here, Bob, take care of this. Coincidentally enough, that book came out right around the time that they actually did an episode with him leaping into a man in the electric chair. And as far as the legal aspects of it, you'll have to check with Bob to see how accurate the TV show was compared to his script. One of my favorites was issue 4. I wanted desperately to do a Christmas story. And they had done one on the TV show that was kind of like a takeoff on Scrooge. I said, no. How about if he leaps into a department store Santa Claus who may or may not be the real Santa Claus?
Yeah.
And I came up with the idea for the cover image. I said, I would like Al to be wearing this big green fur coat with lights on it, so he almost looked like a Christmas tree.
Yeah.
And the artist who did all the covers, wonderful artist named Winston Taylor, he told me, he says, I had to get all the neighborhood kids together and line them up to get pictures of them so that he could draw all the kids so all those kids are probably adults at this point, were all kids from his neighborhood that made it on the cover of issue 4.
Oh, wow. Awesome. Yeah, it's such a fun issue, and I like to read it every Christmas. It's nice and festive, and the kind of thing you could probably only get away with in the strip.
And there were certain things in there that weren't in the script that the artist took liberties to, and he did like panels of like stockings for everybody. And like he did one for Gushy and it had a bottle of mouthwash in it and all. And he did one for Sam that was empty. And I just saw this and I just started laughing. I said, we're keeping this in there.
Yeah. Great. I'm so glad you did, because that contributed towards a special issue. And there were so many of those issues that stood out as being something different and trying to do something that couldn't happen on TV.
And in the third issue, Steve Dorfman, he was a writer-researcher for Jeopardy. And we had gotten in contact with him because one of their bonus Jeopardy questions was a Lost in Space question, and they used the cover from our first issue. So he was trying to branch out and do other freelance writing, as writers often do. And I said, oh, so you work for a game show, huh? How about doing one about the 50s game show scandals? So it went on like that. Issue 5, Terry Collins, who sadly has since passed away, he worked on a local newspaper, and I said, you're going to do one with a local newspaper. And I had, who else was? Well, some of them, Andy Mangels, the guy I had previously mentioned, he was very vocal in the gay community. And the fans were very upset with the one early gay episode they did where the woman was the killer, and they didn't like the portrayal on TV. So I said, okay, Andy, here's your chance. Take care of it. Make him jump back into the same woman 10, 15 years later after she gets out of prison. So he did the whole Stonewall riot thing. And it was very, very well received amongst fans and most people. Of course, we did get some hate mail and a couple of death threats because this was the 90s. But otherwise, most of the writers, they had some real world connection to the subject matter I gave them.
Did that not present you with a bit of a challenge when, just thinking back to when you were initially saying we want the Quantum Leap license? Most comic books have some kind of broad storyline. You went after something that has got a new storyline every week, and you wanted specifically to get people with real world experience. Well, it was a no-brainer for me because my motto is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And there was nothing that needed to be fixed about this property. Not only did we have an awesome concept, but I had the latitude to use different writers in different. No one story had to be the same. I didn't have to have a writer and say, okay, you're going to write this issue, but it has to tie into this. There was none of that. They had free reign to write based on whatever I did the leap in as. Right. Yeah, I didn't really think about the fact that actually it's a two sides to the coin, right? You have that does give you that flexibility to be able to go anywhere. And just in terms, you said the word latitude. In terms of the relationship with Universal, was there much involvement in terms of getting things past them? What was the relationship there like?
They were actually very good. They were one of the better licenses to deal with. A lot of licensing companies will have committees that have to justify their existence just by picking things wrong with a property. Nobody there did that because they were all very much focused on producing the TV show every week, and the licensing department was pretty good about things. The only time we ever had problems with them was we begged them to get these comic books into the Universal Studios gift shops, and they wouldn't do it because the price point wasn't high enough for them. But that was the only problem we ever had with them. And as far as the Quantum Leap people themselves, we had a direct line to like an executive secretary at the actual production company. So they would approve the things over the phone. Say, here's our story, this is what we want to do. And they're like, yeah, that's okay, go ahead. And I don't recall them ever telling us not to do something. As long as we had the artists get the likenesses of Scott Bakula and Dean Stockwell correct, they were happy.
And on the topic of the art, you had quite a wide range of different styles throughout the issues. Was there a conscious attempt to match the story style with the artist?
Not really. It was more economics.
Who was available at the time?
Different artists came and went. And we all dealt with freelancers. We had no staff artists. So, whoever was available that month, we needed to get a book churned out. Do this. All you have to remember is that the likenesses have to look correct. If it
Yeah.
doesn't look like them, it's a problem. Because the fan club, next to the Anne Rice fans, the Quantum Leap fans are the most devoted and rabid of the fan bases that are out there. To the point where I was working late one day. It was like 7 o'clock in the evening, and I get a phone call. And there was some woman on the phone, and this wasn't like a young teeny bar. This woman sounded like she was in her 40s or 50s. She was an older woman, and she got me on the phone and was taking me to task because in certain issues we would draw Scott Bakula and they would color him without that white streak in his hair. And that's how
the white streak.
Yeah, he had a white streak in his hair. The actor did, naturally. And that's what they were obsessed with. Everything had to be perfect for these people. So we were under the microscope for that. But otherwise, things went along pretty swimmingly.
Well, if the white streak is the worst thing you had feedback about, that sounds like it was well received by fans.
Again, like I said, except for issue 9 with the Stonewall Riot gay theme, we didn't really get any negative feedback from anybody.
And just going back to that, the Universal topic, and also something you mentioned earlier, I know. So you, by sheer coincidence, you had the electric chair storyline. You also had issue 8, all set in the future, which was very similar to Kill in Time, that came out around about the same time. How you were obviously sharing brainwaves with Don Belisario somehow.
We were, because we had no contact back and forth with that. I just came up. It just one day I just said, Bill Spangler, the guy that was going to write that, his real world experience was being a writer, and I said, well, but tell you what. We're always doing stories from Sam's point of view in the past. Why don't we do a story of somebody in the waiting room from the future? Our story was vastly different than theirs, but it was eerie because our book came out the day after the episode appeared on TV.
Right.
So it was too close together for anybody to accuse us of ripping them off. But it was just an odd coincidence.
Well, clearly there was a view that fandom was ready for that, and it was the inspiration that you and Belisario both had at the same time. Mad. So you had a couple of issues that, by coincidence, had parallels to the series. Were there any other storylines that you were thinking about running but had to pull back? I know, for example, that the electric chair one had to have some rewrites at the last minute, or had to be completely reshuffled. Were there any other big changes you had to make when you saw something on screen?
No, we followed our own path, and it was only those 2 instances where things dovetailed real close together with the actual series. But by and large, my writers were pretty creative, and I guess I was just clever enough to come up with concepts for them to write without digging too deeply into the show.
Yeah. And you mentioned at the start, you wrote the first issue, and you also co-wrote issue 6 as well, Tale of Two Cindy's.
Yes, with my younger sister.
Okay. All right. So what can you tell us about, you say you were looking for writers with real world experience, but when you were effectively assigning yourself those 2, or co-assigning in the case of issue 6,
well,
what was the thinking there? Where did that inspiration come from?
My self-assignment was basically, okay, I'm a cartoonist and a writer. That is my real world experience, but I love the show, so I can extrapolate from what they're doing. And for the first issue, I thought, well, up till that point, he'd been leaping in and handling things for individual people that on a small scale. And I said, well, what happens if he leaps in by a major real world event, but he's not there for that? So I did the whole thing with him in the lower income school around the time of the assassination of Martin Luther King. He knew that was going to happen. He wanted to do something about it. That's not what he was there for. So that could play off the emotions of Sam feeling frustrated about not being able to do things. For issue 6, I just said, what if he leaps into one of a pair of twins? Because twins have that radar, that twin radar. Mm-hmm. Would the other twin be able to see him as her sister, or see her as Sam in her sister's clothes? So I explored that, and I was talking about that with my sister, and she threw some ideas at me. I said, well, why don't you co-write this with me?
And was that, is she a comic book writer as well?
No,
Was that a new thing for her?
No, she's a property manager. But
Okay.
at the time she was 19, she was going to school. She wanted to do a little bit of freelance writing. So I said, okay, well, we'll write this together. That's the perks of being the editor. You can hire your sister. Nepotism lives.
Nepotism. Hey, you look at the end credits of Quantum Leap, the Belisarios are all over it, so I think you're in good company in terms of nepotism. Nothing wrong with that. Yeah, Waiting. What an original idea, just Sam and Al sitting there talking. And that was that the brief that you gave?
I discussed that with the writer, Scott Rockwell, again, who sadly passed away. We've lost a lot of writers on this series, but I discussed that with him. I said, I would like to do, and I know he was very good with writing characterization. I said, I would like to do an issue where Sam leaps somewhere. He's like out in the middle of nowhere, and he just has to wait for something, and he doesn't know what. So him and Al just get to hang out and talk about, their thoughts on quantum physics and all that. It's just an issue of Sam and Al just sitting there talking to one another. And I said, I don't know what he's waiting to do. And he came up with the idea was, well, he's just waiting for Marilyn Monroe to drive past to give her directions to Hollywood.
Yeah.
And that happened before the Marilyn Monroe episode.
What is it with the TV show? Keeps taking your ideas.
I don't know.
Madness. I definitely want to talk about, and I think I'll throw this in now because otherwise I might forget. I definitely want to talk about the issues that weren't. So I know you'd hoped to do a reprint of issue 2. I know there was an annual, and I know obviously there were plans after One Giant Leap. Could we talk through those one at a time, maybe? And
sure. Well, first
why they didn't come to pass, and
it didn't come to pass because it was the late 90s and companies were dropping like flies, and we were one of them.
Yeah.
So we just went out of business, so we couldn't finish the issues. But the first thing we were going to do after the time and space one, where he leaps into the alien, I came up with the idea of doing Quantum Leap Second Childhood. It was going to be a 3-issue series, and actually the first issue was completely scripted and I believe almost half drawn before we went out of business. And it was written by the woman who was the president of the Quantum Leap fan club.
Yeah, Christina Mavridis.
Yes, it was written by her. Yeah. And basically the idea was that Sam leaps into the same kid at 3 different stages of his childhood. First as an infant, and she wrote a story about him getting kidnapped. The second one, he was going to be 5 years old, and the writer that was going to write that, Scott Rockwell, who also wrote the issue Waiting. Mm-hmm. He was going to have him as a 5-year-old who either I'm unclear on the details, but either he himself or one of his friends was a childhood victim of abuse. And then I was going to write the third one where he was 12 years old and he got involved with the cult of Sam, which was involved with all these people who Sam had leaped into. And from their perspective, they blacked out. They woke up in this strange room looking like somebody else. And then when they woke back up in their own lives, everything was great. So it became like a religious cult about Sam. And they had a mural of Sam's face on the wall because they all looked like him, so they knew what he looked like. Yeah. And so this boy was a 12-year-old boy who was involved with this cult, and Sam's goal during that time was to help shut down the cult, because if it became public knowledge prior to the beginning of the Quantum Leap project, the project would have been shelved and never would have came to be.
Wow, that's amazing. And I mean, since that would have been, 93? So since then, I know one of the novels tried exploring a Leapies experiences afterwards, and the new series has brought back one of the Leapies from the original series as a regular. So there's clearly this desire to see what they're like, or what life is like post the Leap experience. Thing about this
3-issue series was, and I was working with the artist who wasn't, we were trying to work out logistics, but we were going to include a center fold-in in each issue, which was 1/3 of a child's growth chart, which would have Sam at each age And then, so you got
Yeah.
all three of them, you put them together, you'd have a child's growth chart. And then and because we were mercenary about it, about 6 months later, we would have released a full growth chart.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But that was one of my favorite gimmicks, and it sadly never came to pass.
And when you say gimmick, do you mean the growth chart or the trilogy storyline?
Well, plus we found that we did 12 straight issues, Quantum Leap 1 through 12, and then we found out that, once you get above 10, people start to lose interest, so we would do them as special one-shots. So
Right.
issue 13 was really time and space special.
Yeah.
Quantum Leap Second Childhood would have been issues 14, 15, and 16. And it would have said that in the indicia in the first page, but the covers would have, the way comic distributors, they were looking for those big things. This was the 90s, after all, the death of Superman and all that kind of stuff. They were looking for catchy gimmicks. So we were playing ball with them just so we could keep publishing the books.
Yeah. And I mean, this is 93 by this point. This is the time when the series is also getting involved in gimmicks. They did their own trilogy as well. They started introducing recurring characters as well. So it was the time for it. And you must excuse me because I leapt ahead to the end of the story. So let's dial back a little bit as well, because before that, the two other ones that never came to pass. I know you'd hoped to reprint issue 2. I think issue 7 leaped back into issue 2. So
yeah, we were going to reprint issue 2 because, much like we did with reprinting issue 1, because those two issues sold out.
Yeah.
So we were going to reprint issue 2 with more photographs and articles from the Quantum Leap convention at Universal Studios, and it just the numbers weren't there for the reprint, so we just had to shelve that project.
Oh, it's unfortunate, but I suppose these things happen.
I guess everybody that wanted to read that story had a copy of it. So,
yes, I suppose so. And the other one that interests me is, Waiting leaped out into that tantalizing and so frustrating for those of us that have been collecting the comics for years, that tantalizing cliffhanger into the heart attack storyline, which would have been part of the annual. Is that right? That
would have been the annual. That was one that I was going to write. What would have happened in that story is he leaped into this woman just as she was getting the defibrillators. And that screwed up the whole mechanics of the leap. So what would have happened is she would have been comatose in the waiting room, and they would have had to bring in the scientists and the doctors to help save this woman's heart, which they had technology then that wasn't around in the 60s when she was having the heart attack. And what had happened during the leap, Sam then leaped into Ziggy, who leaped into Sam as the woman.
So is this the same story? Because I'd heard about the Ziggy leap.
Yes,
I was going to ask about that afterwards. So this is all the same.
What was going to happen was that the leap occurred so that Ziggy, as an AI who learned from things and had intelligence, didn't have empathy, didn't have human empathy. So when he would, when Al would come back and say, Ziggy says there's a 78% chance you have to save this guy. Well, what about that guy? Well, we can't worry about that. Well, now for Ziggy to operate at peak efficiency, Ziggy needed to develop empathy. So he was in Sam as that woman, learning to be human. But the adverse to that was Sam was in Ziggy and was becoming less and less human as the story went on, to the point where he started out with calling him Al, and by the end he was calling him Admiral Calavici. It was very formal with him. And so it was the ticking time bomb. You had to finish the leap before Sam was completely lost in the AI.
Wow, some huge stories towards the end of the range there that almost happened. I take it that would have been more than the normal 24 page or whatever it was. That sounds big. Oh, I'm sad now. That never happened. That sounds so cool.
And I could never go back to it now because I'm in a completely different mental place than I was back then.
Yeah. So we get up to 93, Innovation Folds, which I gather is effectively what took the Quantum Leap license away. You potentially would have carried on doing Quantum after that, but we already talked about Second
The
Childhood.
books that we were doing that were successful that we would have kept doing were Quantum Leap, Lost in Space, and we had started doing Mac Bolan, the Executioner, which was the original novel that they loosely based The Punisher on. So those books were successful for us. If we'd have kept going, those were the ones we would have kept going, and we would have looked for additional licenses of things.
Yeah. Such a shame. So what happened for you after that? Did you go on to work at a different publisher?
Well, I moved back to my native Pittsburgh, and I met my at that time my future wife, and I didn't want to. I had offers to go to Dark Horse out in Oregon and Archie up in New York, but I didn't want to leave because I just was starting a personal life. So I just kind of freelanced around for a little bit and did a couple of odd jobs for different companies. I worked for a company for a short period of time where I was designing wind chimes. And then I started getting teaching gigs where I was teaching cartooning to kids. And since that time, I have been pretty much self-publishing things. And with the advent of things like print on demand, I can get much more full-color books that I don't have to print 2, 3, 4, 500 books. I can print 6 books if I want to, sell them at a comic convention, and then print 6 more. So I've been doing that for the past, good 15, 20 years now.
And can the listeners buy those online as well as at conventions?
You can find them on Amazon. You can find them on Amazon, just typing my name in. You can find them on barnesandnoble.com, or you can go to my website, www.georgebroderick.com, and I have links to everywhere that you can buy those books.
Great stuff. Well, we'll add the link to the website and to the Amazon search page on our show notes as well. Is there anything else that you wanted to share with us that I've not touched on during the interview? Anything for the Leapers?
Well, just that I appreciated the fan support that we got from the fan club over the few years that we were publishing. They were really, really very nice and helpful with a lot of suggestions a lot of the times. And I appreciate the show itself was very inviting. At one point, we were out at the San Diego Comic-Con, and they invited us up on the back lot to view a filming of one of the episodes. And it was the one where Sam was on a raft with Brooke Shields. I'm not sure what that episode was all about, but we got to see that. We got to meet and talk with Scott Bakula for a little while, and one of the producer directors, Parker Wade, who bears an uncanny resemblance to Robert Culp. The man looks just like him, and we got to see. I nodded at Dean Stockwell. We were out there for his Hollywood Walk of Fame star, and I nodded to him. He nodded back. But what was nice to see was that he was very much into environmentalism, and on the set they didn't have any paper, plastic, or styrofoam. Everything was regular china plates and regular silverware. So I said, well, the guy puts his money where his mouth is.
What a cool experience. And such kind words from you to the fans. So thank you for sharing that. And thank you for sharing your memories over the last half hour. It's been really interesting talking to you, and I've learned so much about the comic range. As I say, I'm still tracking down the authors, so I've spoken to a couple of them recently, and I know I'll have more interviews over the next few months. But this has helped really give me a grounding in the whole range and understanding how it all came together.
Yeah, it was an interesting time, and I'm glad that I did it. And I like I said, I'm still a fan of the show. I'm actually even enjoying the new one because of the callbacks to some of the older things.
Right.
Obviously Dean Stockwell's passed away, but they figured out a way to bring his daughter in, and I love the fact that they brought Magic in.
Yes. Yeah, that was, for those of us following along early on, that was so unexpected that when the news of that first leaked, we all thought that was fan fiction. It was somebody making it up because they wouldn't bring back a Leapy from the original series. What a crazy idea. And then it turned out to be true. And it's really good. It's great to hear you're watching, still following along. We're all... Well, I know a lot of us are hoping that Universal start looking at licenses again, and maybe the new series can get its own comic spin-off and some novels.
There are rumors.
There's rumors, are there?
Yes.
I haven't heard any rumors.
Well, there's rumors in my circle.
You would be more likely to know than me, so how exciting. All right, well, stay tuned, everyone, then. And George, we'll definitely stay in touch because I'm sure as I delve more into the work on the book, I might need to pick your brains on some things. But for now, what a great chat this has been, and thank you for sharing so much information with us and so much of your time.
It was almost like I leaped. It's 32 years ago.